The gunshot echoed across the plains, splitting the Montana sky wide open as Kieran Ellis dropped to his knees in the tall grass. He wasn't hit. The bullet had been fired from his own revolver, a desperate signal for help that wouldn't come soon enough to save his boy. Montana Territory, 1876. Thomas. Kieran's voice was hoarse, his throat raw from shouting his son's name for the past 2 hours. The 10-year-old had been thrown from his horse while they were checking fence lines on the far edge of their property. The fall had been bad, too bad, and Kieran had known at the moment he'd seen the unnatural angle of his son's neck. He gathered the small body into his arms, mounted his horse with Thomas cradled against his chest, and rode hard toward home. But halfway there, the boy had stopped breathing, his face peaceful as though he'd simply fallen asleep. Now Kieran sat in the dirt, his son's body growing cold in his arms, his world collapsing into darkness around him. Thomas had been all he had left after his wife, Sarah, died of fever 3 winters ago. The boy had been the only reason Kieran kept going, kept working the ranch, kept living. The funeral was held 2 days later. Most of the residents of nearby Whispering Pines came to pay their respects. Kieran stood stone-faced by the small grave, accepting handshakes and murmured condolences with vacant eyes. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. He had moved through the preparations like a man sleepwalking, letting the town's preacher make most of the arrangements. Mr. Ellis. A soft voice broke through the fog. "I'm so terribly sorry for your loss." Kieran looked down into the face of a woman he vaguely recognized. Bethany Norwood, the widow who'd moved to town about a year ago. Her husband had been killed in a mining accident not long after they'd arrived. She had no children, lived alone in a small cabin just outside of town, and kept to herself mostly, though she sold baked goods and jams at the general store. "Thank you, Mrs. Norwood," he replied, the words automatic and empty. She held his gaze a moment longer than was customary, her blue eyes reflecting a pain that mirrored his own. "If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Kieran nodded curtly, then turned away. He didn't need anything from anyone. What he needed couldn't be given back to him. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of whiskey and silence. Kieran abandoned his work on the ranch, letting fields go fallow and cattle wander. He rode into town only for supplies, mostly bottles, and avoided conversation whenever possible. 3 months after Thomas's death, on a scorching July afternoon, Kieran was slumped on his front porch, an empty bottle at his feet and another half empty in his hand, when the sound of an approaching wagon roused him from his stupor. He squinted against the sunlight, making out the silhouette of a woman driving a small cart. As she drew closer, he recognized Bethany Norwood, her dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her face flushed from the heat. She pulled her horse to a stop in front of his house and regarded him steadily. "Mr. Ellis, Mrs. Norwood." His voice was rough from disuse. "What brings you out here?" "I brought you some food," she said simply, climbing down from the cart. "And I've come to help." Kieran scowled. "I don't recall asking for help." "You didn't," she agreed, unloading a basket from the back of her cart. "But you need it all the same. With all due respect, madam, I'd prefer to be left alone." Bethany set the basket down on the porch step and looked around at the neglected property, the overgrown grass, the broken fence posts, the thin cattle visible in the distance. Then she looked at Kieran, taking in his unkempt beard, filthy clothes, and bloodshot eyes. "Your son wouldn't want this," she said quietly. Rage flared hot in Kieran's chest. "Don't you dare tell me what my son would want," he growled, rising unsteadily to his feet. "You didn't know him." "No," she admitted, "but I know what it is to lose someone you love more than life itself." I know what it is to want to die yourself rather than face another day without them." Her words doused his anger like cold water, leaving only the familiar hollow ache. "Then you know there's no help for it." "I know that grief doesn't end," she said. "But I also know that life can continue alongside it if you let it." She hesitated, then added softly, "I've been watching you destroy yourself for months now. I couldn't stand by any longer." "Why do you care?" "Because someone once cared for me when I was where you are now." She picked up the basket and held it out to him. "I've brought stew, bread, and some preserves. Eat something. And when you're ready, I'll be back tomorrow to help you start setting things right around here." Kieran stared at her, wanting to send her away but too exhausted to muster the effort. "I didn't ask for your pity." "This isn't pity, Mr. Ellis. This is one survivor reaching out to another." She set the basket down when he made no move to take it. "I'll return tomorrow at dawn. You can send me away then if you wish, but I hope you won't." Without waiting for a response, she turned, climbed back onto her cart, and drove away, leaving Kieran staring after her with the first stirrings of something other than grief in his chest. It wasn't hope, he was far from that, but perhaps it was the faintest recognition that he was still alive, whether he wanted to be or not. The next morning, Kieran was awakened by a persistent knocking. He opened his eyes to sunlight streaming through the windows and realized with surprise that he'd slept through the night without nightmares for the first time in months. He pulled on his clothes and opened the door to find Bethany standing there, dressed in a simple work dress with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back with a scarf. "You're still here," she observed. "It's my house," he replied gruffly. A small smile touched her lips. "I meant in this world you could have ridden off or done something foolish." Kieran frowned. "I'm not a coward, Mrs. Norwood. I never thought you were." She looked past him into the house, which was in a state of squalid disarray. "May I come in?" He hesitated, then stepped aside. Bethany entered and immediately began opening windows, letting in fresh air and more light. "First things first," she said briskly. "We need to make this place livable again. Then we'll see to your cattle and fields." "We?" Kieran asked, bewildered by her presumption. "Yes, we." "You can't do it alone, not in your condition. And I've got 2 strong hands and a willingness to work." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "I lost my husband 16 months ago, Mr. Ellis. I know something about grief." "And yet here you are, seemingly fine," he said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "You think so?" She met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm not fine, I'll never be fine again, but I've found a way to keep living anyway." Her honesty disarmed him. "Why help me? You hardly know me." "Because when James died, people helped me. The mining company did nothing, claimed it was his own fault for not being careful, but the town rallied around me. I wouldn't have survived without them." She paused. "And because no one should face this kind of loss alone." Something in her words, or perhaps the direct, compassionate way she looked at him, broke through Kieran's defenses. He felt his throat tighten and looked away before she could see the moisture gathering in his eyes. "I don't know if I can be helped, Mrs. Norwood. Call me Bethany, please." "And you won't know until we try." She rolled up her sleeves further. "Now shall we start with this kitchen? It's a disaster." To his own surprise, Kieran found himself nodding. "Yes, Bethany, we can start there." Over the next few days, Bethany arrived each morning at dawn and stayed until sunset, helping Kieran slowly reclaim his home and ranch from neglect. They cleaned the house from top to bottom, mended broken furniture, and washed linens that had gone untouched for months. They repaired fences, rounded up straying cattle, and assessed what could be salvaged of his crops. Kieran worked alongside her silently at first, following her lead as though in a trance. But gradually, the physical labor began to clear his head. The exhaustion at the end of each day allowed him to sleep without the aid of whiskey. And Bethany's quiet, steady presence became something he found himself looking forward to. A week into their arrangement, as they sat on his porch eating a simple supper she had prepared, Kieran finally asked the question that had been troubling him. "Don't you have your own place to tend to? Your own work?" Bethany nodded, wiping her hands on a napkin. "I do. I get up at 4 to handle my chores before coming here, and I do more when I return home in the evenings." Kieran stared at her, astonished by the revelation. "That's a punishing schedule. Why would you do that?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the sunset painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "After James died, I nearly let everything go just like you did. I didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't care if I lived or died. Then one day Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, came to my cabin and simply wouldn't leave. She cooked for me, cleaned around me, talked to me even when I wouldn't respond." Bethany turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. She said something I'll never forget. She said, "Grief is a room where the door is always open. You don't get to leave it completely, but you can learn to visit other rooms too." Kieran felt something stir in his chest, an ache that wasn't entirely painful. "And you believe that?" "I live it every day," she said softly. "I still visit that room of grief. I still miss James with every breath. But I've found other rooms to work, purpose, helping others. It doesn't make the grief room any smaller, but it makes my house bigger, if that makes sense." He nodded slowly. "I think it does." He hesitated, then added, "Thomas would have liked you. He was always bringing home strays, birds with broken wings, abandoned kittens. He had a way of seeing what needed saving." It was the first time he'd spoken his son's name aloud since the funeral, and the weight of it hung in the air between them. Bethany didn't rush to fill the silence or offer platitudes. She simply nodded and let him sit with the memory. "Tell me about him," she said after a while. "If you'd like to." And to his surprise, Kieran found that he did want to. Words that had been bottled up for months poured out as the sky darkened around them. He told her about Thomas's laugh, his curiosity about everything, how he'd named every horse and cow on the ranch. He told her about teaching him to ride, to fish, to read by lamplight. He told her about the time Thomas had hidden a litter of kittens in his bedroom for 3 days before Kieran discovered them. Somewhere in the telling, tears began to fall, but Kieran didn't stop. It felt like lancing a wound, painful but necessary, releasing poison that had been festering too long. Bethany listened without interruption, offering nothing but her attention and occasional nods of understanding. When he finally fell silent, exhausted by the outpouring, she reached over and briefly squeezed his hand. "Thank you for sharing him with me," she said simply. "He sounds like a remarkable boy." "He was," Kieran replied, his voice rough with emotion. "He was the best of me." "Then honor him by finding the best in yourself again," Bethany said, rising to her feet. "I should get back before it's fully dark." Kieran stood as well, suddenly reluctant to see her go. Thank you for today, for all of it," she smiled, a genuine expression that softened her features. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Ellis." "Kieran," he corrected her. "If I'm to call you Bethany, then fair's fair." Her smile widened. "Until tomorrow then, Kieran." As he watched her drive away, Kieran realized that for the first time since Thomas's death, he was looking forward to the dawn of a new day. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. Bethany would arrive early. They would work side by side on whatever needed attention most urgently. Share the midday meal, continue working until the light began to fade, then sit on the porch talking as they ate a simple supper. Kieran gradually took more initiative, planning the day's work before she arrived, making repairs she hadn't noticed needed doing. His body, once soft from inactivity and drink, hardened again with labor. The clarity returned to his eyes, and occasionally he found himself laughing at something Bethany said. The first time it happened, they both froze in surprise, Kieran looking almost guilty for experiencing a moment of joy. But Bethany had smiled warmly at him. "It's allowed, you know," she had said quietly, "to feel things other than grief. It doesn't mean you've forgotten him." As summer gave way to early fall, the ranch began to thrive again. The house was clean and orderly, the animals healthy, the immediate repairs completed. Kieran knew their arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Bethany was neglecting her own affairs to help him, and he was regaining his ability to manage alone. One evening in late September, as they sat watching fireflies dance over the fields, Kieran cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly. "You've done more than enough here, more than I had any right to expect. It's time I let you get back to your own life." Bethany turned to look at him, an unreadable expression on her face. "Are you saying you don't need my help anymore?" "I'm saying I can't keep taking advantage of your kindness." He met her gaze. "You've pulled me back from the edge, Bethany. I won't ever be able to repay that debt." "There is no debt," she said firmly. "That's not how this works. Even so, you have your own place to tend to, your own life to live." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the darkening land. "And if I told you I've come to value these days, that helping you has helped me too?" Kieran felt a strange flutter in his chest. "What do you mean?" Bethany sighed softly. "After James died, I kept going because I had to. I worked, I existed, but there was no purpose to it. Helping you, seeing you come back to life, it's given me something I didn't know I was missing." She smiled faintly. "I suppose we've been helping each other." The realization struck Kieran that he would miss her terribly if she stopped coming. Her steady presence had become as essential to his days as the sunrise. But was that fair to her? "I don't want to be your charity case forever," he said finally. "Is that what you think this is?" She sounded genuinely surprised. "Charity? What else would you call it?" Bethany shook her head, a hint of frustration in her expression. "Friendship, perhaps, or is that too presumptuous?" "No," Kieran said quickly. "Not presumptuous at all." He hesitated, then added, "You are my friend, the only real one I have left, I think." Her expression softened. "Then, as your friend, I'll make you a proposition. I'll continue coming here, but not every day. 3 days a week, perhaps, and on the other days you can help me with my place." "Your place?" Kieran repeated, surprised. "Yes. My roof leaks in 2 places, my garden needs to be prepared for winter, and there's a broken axle on my cart that I've been making do with for too long." She raised an eyebrow. "Unless you think I'm too proud to accept help in return." A slow smile spread across Kieran's face, the most genuine one he'd managed in months. "That sounds fair," he agreed. "More than fair." And so their arrangement evolved. Kieran began visiting Bethany's small homestead, finding satisfaction in fixing things that had gone too long neglected. Her cabin was neat, but in need of repairs that required a man's strength. He replaced rotted boards, repaired her roof, built new shelves in her pantry, and helped harvest and preserve the bounty from her garden. In the process, he learned more about her. How she had come west with James full of dreams. How they had planned to start a family once they were established. How all those hopes had died with him in the mine collapse. He saw the small portrait of her husband. She kept by her bed a serious-looking man with kind eyes, and recognized the same lingering grief in Bethany that he carried himself. One afternoon in mid-October, as they worked side by side picking the last of her apples, Kieran found himself studying her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the wisp of dark hair that had escaped her bonnet to curl against her cheek. She was not a conventionally beautiful woman, but there was a quiet strength and grace to her that he had come to deeply admire. As if sensing his gaze, she turned, catching him watching her. Instead of looking away, he smiled. "What?" she asked, a slight flush rising to her cheeks. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am that you're so stubborn," he replied. "If you'd given up on me that first day or the second—" "I'm not stubborn," she protested. "I'm persistent. There's a difference." "Is there?" he teased, surprising himself with the lightness in his tone. "Stubbornness is refusing to see reason. Persistence is refusing to give up on something worthwhile." She met his eyes. "And you, Kieran Ellis, are worthwhile." The simple statement affected him more deeply than he could have expected. He looked away, suddenly overcome with emotion. "I wasn't." "Not for a long time." "You were," she insisted quietly. "Even at your worst, you just couldn't see it." He shook his head, not in disagreement but in wonder at her perception. "How did you know that I could come back from it?" Bethany was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently tracing the surface of an apple. "The day of your son's funeral, when you looked at me, there was such raw pain in your eyes. Not emptiness, not deadness, but pain. As long as someone can still feel pain like that, they're not truly lost." She paused. "And I saw how gently you laid that small bundle of wildflowers on his grave. Your hands were shaking, but you placed them so carefully." Kieran remembered that moment, the tiny blue flowers he'd picked, because they were Thomas's favorite color, but he hadn't realized anyone had noticed such a small gesture amidst the formality of the funeral. "You saw me," he said softly, "when I couldn't see myself." "Sometimes we need someone else's eyes to remind us who we are." She smiled and handed him another apple. "Now help me finish these before the sun sets." As they worked, Kieran realized something had shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained, the boundary between helper and helped, had blurred into something more equal, more intimate. It both comforted and unsettled him. Winter came early that year, with the first heavy snow falling before Thanksgiving. Travel between their two properties became more difficult, but they maintained their arrangement, each visiting the other a few times each week when weather permitted. On Christmas Eve, Kieran rode through swirling snow to Bethany's cabin, a small package tucked inside his coat. The previous Christmas had passed in a blur of grief and whiskey. He barely remembered it. This year, though still tinged with sadness at Thomas's absence, felt different. He had something to give, someone to share the day with. Bethany opened her door at his knock, her face lighting up with pleasure at the sight of him. The cabin was warm and fragrant with the smell of baking. A small evergreen branch decorated with ribbons and paper stars standing in the corner. "I wasn't sure you'd make it through this weather," she said, taking his coat and hanging it by the fire to dry. "I wouldn't miss it," he replied simply. "Merry Christmas, Bethany." She smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Merry Christmas, Kieran. Come warm yourself. Supper is almost ready." They ate by candlelight, sharing a meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and the last of her preserved summer vegetables. Kieran found himself relaxing in the intimate atmosphere of her small home, the howling wind outside making the warmth within seem all the more precious. After the meal, they sat by the fire, and Kieran gathered his courage to present his gift. It was a small carved wooden box with a sliding lid, polished to a warm glow. "I made this for you," he said, feeling suddenly shy as he handed it to her. "It's not much, but it's beautiful," Bethany interrupted, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Did you carve this yourself?" He nodded. "I used to make things for Thomas toys, mostly. I haven't touched my carving tools since. Well, in a long time." She opened the box to find a delicate wooden pendant inside, carved in the shape of a wildflower and threaded onto a simple leather cord. "Oh, Kieran," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "It's meant to be an evening primrose," he explained, "like the ones that grow along your garden fence. I noticed you looking at them often this summer." Bethany's eyes shone with moisture as she looked up at him. "They were James's favorite. He used to say they reminded him that beauty can bloom even in darkness." She slipped the cord over her head, the pendant resting just below her collarbone. "I'll treasure this always." She rose and went to a small trunk in the corner, returning with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you as well." Kieran unwrapped it to find a hand-knitted scarf in a deep blue color. As he unfolded it, something fell into his lap, a small, framed pencil drawing of Thomas, captured in perfect detail, his smile wide and his eyes bright with mischief. He stared at it in shock, unable to speak. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter is quite talented," Bethany explained softly. "I described him to her from your stories, and she made this. If it's too painful or not right, you don't have to. It's perfect," Kieran interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. The likeness was uncanny, capturing not just Thomas's features but his spirit. How did you? "You've spoken of him so often, so vividly. I feel as though I know him." Bethany moved to sit beside him on the small sofa. "I wanted you to have something to see, not just memories to hold." Kieran traced the outline of his son's face with a trembling finger. "Thank you," he whispered. "I can't tell you what this means to me." On impulse, he reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly in his own. The touch ignited something between them, an awareness that had been building for months, carefully unacknowledged by both. Bethany's eyes met his, wide with surprise, and something else, something that mirrored the sudden tumult in his own chest. For a breathless moment, he thought he might lean forward, close the small distance between them, but the moment passed. Kieran released her hand and carefully set the drawing on the table beside him. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." The evening continued with a careful return to safer ground, conversation about plans for spring planting, news from town, predictions about how long the winter might last. Yet something had changed. A door had opened that couldn't be entirely closed again. As Kieran prepared to leave, the storm having temporarily abated, Bethany stood in the doorway watching him saddle his horse. "Be careful," she called. "The trail will be treacherous in the dark." "I will," he promised, mounting up. "Thank you for tonight, Bethany, for everything." She touched the wooden pendant at her throat, her expression soft in the lantern light. "Merry Christmas, Kieran. Safe journey home." As he rode through the silent, snow-covered landscape, Kieran realized with startling clarity that for the first time since Thomas's death, he was thinking of the future rather than the past. And in that future, unbidden but undeniable, was Bethany's face. The realization brought both guilt and hope in equal measure. Was it a betrayal of his grief to feel this way? Or was it, as Bethany had suggested months ago, simply finding another room to visit while the room of grief remained? Winter gradually released its grip on the land, and with the coming of spring, both Kieran's ranch and Bethany's small homestead required increasing attention. They continued their arrangement of helping each other, but something tentative had grown between them since Christmas night, a careful awareness, an unspoken possibility. Kieran found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that went beyond friendship. He noticed things about her he hadn't before: the graceful way she moved, the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes when she smiled, the subtle floral scent that seemed to cling to her hair. One warm evening in early May, as they sat on Kieran's porch after a day spent planting his kitchen garden, Bethany mentioned a town dance scheduled for the following weekend. "Mrs. Patterson insisted I attend this year," she said, sounding somewhat reluctant. "I haven't been to one since James died." Kieran looked at her profile in the fading light. "Will you go?" She shrugged slightly. "I suppose I should. Life continues as we've both learned." She glanced at him. "Perhaps you might consider coming as well." The invitation caught him off guard. "I'm not much for dancing." "Nor am I," she admitted. "But it might be good for both of us to rejoin the world a bit more." He considered it, realizing that he had indeed been living in isolation except for his interactions with Bethany. The thought of facing the town's collective pity and curiosity was daunting, but the idea of watching Bethany potentially dance with other men was somehow worse. "I'll go," he said finally, "if you'll save me a dance." Her smile was worth any discomfort the event might bring. "I'd be honored." The night of the dance arrived clear and mild. Kieran bathed thoroughly, trimmed his beard, and put on his best shirt, one that had hung unworn in his closet since Thomas's funeral. He felt both ridiculous and nervous as he rode into town, like a schoolboy rather than a grown man of 34. The town hall was transformed with lanterns and spring flowers, a small band playing in one corner, tables of food and punch along one wall. Kieran hesitated in the doorway, suddenly overwhelmed by the noise and activity after so many months of quiet isolation. Then he saw her across the room, standing with Mrs. Patterson and another woman he didn't recognize. Bethany wore a simple dress of cornflower blue, her dark hair arranged more elaborately than usual, with a few curls framing her face. The wooden pendant he had carved rested at her throat. As if sensing his presence, she looked up, and their eyes met across the crowded room. Her smile of recognition gave him the courage to cross the threshold and make his way toward her. "You came," she said when he reached her, genuine pleasure in her voice. "I said I would." He nodded politely to Mrs. Patterson, who was watching them with undisguised interest. "Good evening, ladies." Mrs. Patterson beamed at him. "Mr. Ellis, how wonderful to see you here. Bethany didn't mention you would be attending." "It was a recent decision," Kieran replied, feeling uncomfortably scrutinized. "Well, I'm sure Bethany is glad for a familiar face," the older woman said with a knowing smile. "If you'll excuse me, I see the Reverend needs my assistance with the punch." When she had gone, Kieran turned back to Bethany with a rueful expression. "I've just realized I've subjected you to town gossip by coming here." "People will talk regardless," she replied with a small shrug. "They've likely been speculating about our arrangement for months." The thought hadn't occurred to Kieran, and he felt a flash of concern. "Has anyone said anything to you? Anything improper?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," she assured him. "Most people have been kind, they're simply curious." Before he could pursue the matter further, the band began a new song, and Kieran remembered his purpose in coming. He held out his hand. "I believe you promised me a dance, Mrs. Norwood." Bethany placed her hand in his, a becoming flush rising to her cheeks. "So I did, Mr. Ellis." He led her onto the dance floor, suddenly aware that it had been years since he had danced with anyone. Sarah had loved dancing, but after her death, there had been no reason to attend such functions. As they took their positions for the waltz, Kieran felt a pang of guilt, quickly followed by the now familiar sensation of Bethany's steady presence pushing back against his darker emotions. "I'm out of practice," he warned as he placed his hand carefully at her waist. "As am I," she replied, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "We'll be unpracticed together." The music swelled, and Kieran began to lead, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as muscle memory returned. Bethany followed his movements naturally, as if they had danced together many times before. "You're doing fine," she murmured, looking up at him with warm eyes. "I had a good teacher," he replied. "Sarah insisted I learn properly before our wedding." At the mention of his late wife, Bethany's expression softened further. "Tell me about her," she said gently. If you'd like to. As they moved around the floor, Kieran found himself speaking of Sarah for the first time in years, her laughter, her stubbornness, her love of music and dancing. It felt strange but right to share these memories with Bethany, who listened with the same attentive care she had shown when he spoke of Thomas. "She sounds remarkable," Bethany said when he fell silent. "Thomas must have inherited his spirit from both of you." "Yes," Kieran agreed, "though his kindness came more from her than me." "I don't know about that," Bethany replied, her eyes holding his. "You've shown me considerable kindness, Kieran Ellis." The way she said his name, the warmth in her gaze, the gentle pressure of her hand in his, it all combined to create a moment of perfect clarity for Kieran. The feelings he had been carefully avoiding acknowledging crystallized into certainty. He was falling in love with Bethany Norwood. The realization must have shown on his face, because her expression changed, becoming questioning, perhaps even hopeful. But before he could find words to express what he was feeling, the music ended and the spell was broken by the applause around them. They separated, Bethany dropping into a small curtsy as Kieran bowed, both actions automatic and slightly awkward in their formality. "Thank you for the dance," she said, her voice a touch breathless. "The pleasure was mine," he replied, meaning it more deeply than the conventional phrase usually implied. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation. Occasional dances, though none as affecting as their first, and a growing awareness on Kieran's part that he needed to speak with Bethany privately, to understand if she might possibly feel the same stirring of emotion that had overtaken him. As the dance wound down and people began to leave, Kieran offered to see Bethany home. She accepted with a nod, and they walked in companionable silence through the quiet streets of Whispering Pines, the moon lighting their way. When they reached her cabin, Bethany turned to face him, the moonlight silvering her features. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said softly. "It meant a great deal to me." Kieran took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Bethany, I need to tell you something." She waited, her expression open but unreadable in the dim light. "These past months you've helped me find my way back to living," he began haltingly. "At first, I thought you were just being kind, doing for me what Mrs. Patterson did for you after your loss, but it's become more than that. At least for me." Bethany remained silent, though her breathing seemed to quicken slightly. "I find myself thinking about you when we're apart," he continued, "looking forward to seeing you again, wanting to make you smile, to hear your laugh." He swallowed hard. "I didn't expect to feel this way again, didn't think I could, and if you don't feel the same, I understand completely. But I needed to tell you that you've become more to me than a friend." In the silence that followed his confession, Kieran felt his heart pounding, certain he had overstepped, ruined the precious friendship they had built. Then Bethany took a step closer, close enough that he could see the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes. "I feel the same," she whispered. "And it frightens me." Relief and joy flooded through him, tempered by understanding of her fear. "It frightens me too," he admitted. "Loving someone means risking loss again." "Yes," she agreed, her voice barely audible, "and there's more. There's guilt, as if caring for someone new somehow diminishes what we felt for those we lost." Kieran nodded, recognizing the exact conflict that had troubled him. "I've thought about that," he said slowly, "and I've come to believe that love isn't a finite resource that gets used up. It's more like—" he searched for the right words, "like a garden that can be replanted. What grows isn't the same as what was there before, but it's still beautiful, still valuable." A tear spilled down Bethany's cheek, catching the moonlight. "That's a lovely way to think of it." Tentatively, Kieran reached out to brush the tear away with his thumb. "I'm not asking for any promises, Bethany, just permission to care for you openly, to see where this might lead if you're willing." She leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm willing," she replied softly. "More than willing." In that moment, the distance between them seemed to disappear. Kieran leaned down as Bethany tilted her face up, and their lips met in a gentle, questioning kiss. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sealed a promise between them, a promise to try, to risk, to hope. When they parted, Bethany's smile was luminous in the moonlight. "Good night, Kieran," she whispered. "Good night, Bethany," he replied, reluctant to leave but knowing this fragile new beginning needed time and space to grow. "I'll see you tomorrow," she confirmed, touching the wooden pendant at her throat in what was becoming a familiar gesture. "We have fence posts to mend." He laughed softly at the prosaic reminder. "So we do." As Kieran rode home through the quiet night, he felt lighter than he had in years, despite the weight of all they had discussed. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be simple. They both carried deep wounds, memories that would never fade, but for the first time since Thomas's death, he found himself genuinely looking forward to the future. Spring blossomed into summer, and with it, Kieran and Bethany's relationship deepened. They continued working together, but now there were stolen kisses amid the labor, hands that lingered when passing tools, conversations that extended long into the evening. The town noticed the change, of course. Mrs. Patterson took particular credit for the match, having introduced them at Thomas's funeral, though both Kieran and Bethany gently corrected this version of events whenever it arose. By midsummer, they had established a comfortable pattern, dividing their time between his ranch and her homestead, sharing meals, chores, and increasingly, their hopes and fears. They spoke often of those they had lost, finding that sharing memories helped keep them alive in a way that private grief had not. One warm July evening, almost a year to the day since Bethany had first arrived at his door with a basket of food and a determination to help, Kieran took her fishing at the small pond on the far edge of his property. It was a peaceful spot, one he had avoided since Thomas's death, as it had been their favorite fishing hole. They sat side by side on the grassy bank, lines cast into the still water, the setting sun painting the scene in gold and amber. Bethany leaned comfortably against Kieran's shoulder, her hat discarded beside her, her dark hair coming loose from its pins. "Thomas loved this pond," Kieran said, breaking a companionable silence. "He once spent an entire day trying to catch the biggest fish in Montana, as he called it. Never did catch it, but he was convinced it was in here somewhere." Bethany smiled at the story. "Perhaps it's still here, waiting for someone patient enough to catch it." "Perhaps," Kieran agreed, setting his fishing rod aside to wrap an arm around her shoulders. "Bethany, there's something I want to ask you." She turned to look at him, her expression curious. "What is it?" Kieran took a deep breath, suddenly nervous despite all they had shared. "I love you," he began. "I think I have for longer than I realized. You brought me back from a darkness I thought would consume me, showed me that life could still hold joy and purpose." Bethany's eyes softened. "I love you too, Kieran. You know that." "I do know," he acknowledged, "and that's why I want to ask if you would consider becoming my wife." Her eyes widened in surprise, though not, he thought, in dismay. "You want to marry me?" "More than anything," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you, Bethany, not to replace what either of us has lost, but to create something new alongside those memories." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the pond's still surface. Just as Kieran was beginning to worry that he had misjudged her feelings, she spoke. "When James died, I thought that part of my life was over," she said softly. "The part where I would be a wife, have a family, share a home with someone who loved me. I accepted that, made peace with it as best I could." She turned back to him, her eyes bright with emotion. Then you came along, or rather, I came along to you and everything changed. Is that a yes?" Kieran asked, hope rising in his chest. Bethany smiled, a full, radiant smile that transformed her face. "Yes, Kieran Ellis, I will marry you." Joy surged through him, and he pulled her into a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a promise of the future they would build together. When they parted, breathless, Bethany laughed, a sound of pure happiness that echoed across the pond. "I don't have a ring," Kieran admitted, suddenly remembering this oversight. "I don't need one," she assured him, touching the wooden pendant she still wore every day. "You've already given me something far more precious." They were married in late September in a simple ceremony at the town's small church. The entire community turned out for the occasion, genuinely happy for the couple who had each endured so much sorrow. Bethany wore a new dress of pale blue silk, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Kieran, clean-shaven for the occasion, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such naked joy that several of the town's more sentimental ladies were moved to tears before the ceremony even began. As they exchanged vows, Kieran felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the broken pieces of his life were finally coming together in a new pattern different from what had been before, but beautiful in its own way. They held their wedding celebration at Kieran's ranch, now their ranch, with tables set up in the yard, lanterns hanging from trees, and music provided by the same small band that had played at the town dance, where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. As the festivities continued around them, Kieran drew Bethany aside for a quiet moment. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "A wedding gift." He produced a small, carved wooden box similar to the one he had given her at Christmas, but slightly larger. When Bethany opened it, she gasped softly. Inside lay a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. "Oh, Kieran," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "It's beautiful." "Open it," he urged gently. She did, revealing two tiny portraits inside, one of James on the left and one of Sarah on the right. Tears welled in Bethany's eyes as she looked up at him. "How did you?" "Mrs. Patterson had a miniature of James she'd kept for you," Kieran explained, "and I still had one of Sarah. I had them copied by an artist in Helena." He took her hands in his. "I wanted you to know that I don't expect you to forget him, just as I know you don't expect me to forget her or Thomas. They'll always be part of us, part of our story." Bethany's tears spilled over, but her smile was radiant through them. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding so perfectly." She removed the wooden pendant she had worn since Christmas, carefully placing it in the box, then allowed Kieran to fasten the locket around her neck. It rested perfectly in the hollow of her throat, catching the golden light of the setting sun. "I'll treasure it always," she promised, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "Just as I'll treasure you, my husband." The words sent a thrill through Kieran. "And I you, my wife." As they rejoined their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, Kieran found himself thinking of Thomas. He could almost see his son running through the crowd, laughing, perhaps stealing an extra piece of cake when no one was looking. The image brought a bittersweet pang, but not the crushing grief it once would have. "What are you thinking?" Bethany asked, noticing his momentary distraction. "About Thomas," Kieran admitted. "About how much he would have liked you." Bethany squeezed his hand. "I like to think he's here with us in his own way. He and Sarah and James watching over us, happy that we've found each other." The thought was comforting, and Kieran found himself nodding. "I believe they are," he said softly. As the celebration continued into the night, with dancing and laughter under the stars, Kieran held his new wife close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of grief to the heights of joy, from isolation to connection, from despair to hope. It was a path he could never have imagined when he knelt in the grass holding his son's lifeless body. Yet here he was, his heart full, his future bright, all because a stubborn widow had refused to let him drown in his sorrow. Bethany had taught him how to keep living when he'd thought it impossible, and in doing so had given them both a second chance at happiness. As they danced beneath the vast Montana sky, surrounded by friends and well-wishers, Kieran whispered in Bethany's ear, "Thank you for saving me." She smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "And we'll keep doing so every day, for all the days we have." It was a promise Kieran knew they would both keep. The years that followed their wedding were filled with the ordinary business of living seasons of planting and harvest, winter storms and summer droughts, the rhythms of ranch life that demanded constant attention and hard work. But woven through these commonplace patterns were golden threads of joy and connection that made even the most routine days meaningful. Kieran and Bethany built their life together with intention, creating new traditions while honoring the memories of those they had lost. They kept a small table in their parlor with photographs of Thomas, Sarah, and James, often placing wildflowers or small treasures there as remembrances. On birthdays and anniversaries, they would share stories, keeping the memories alive without allowing grief to overshadow their present happiness. Their first Christmas as husband and wife, Bethany surprised Kieran by hanging a special ornament on their tree, a small carved horse she had commissioned from a craftsman in Helena, a replica of Thomas's favorite toy. Kieran, in turn, had carved a delicate wooden frame for James's pocket watch, which now sat on their mantel alongside Sarah's favorite book of poetry. These gestures of mutual understanding and respect deepened their love, creating a marriage built on compassion as much as passion. They disagreed at times, of course Bethany's practicality occasionally clashing with Kieran's impulsive nature, but they never went to bed angry, having learned too well how precious and precarious life could be. In their second spring together, as they worked side by side planting the kitchen garden that had become Bethany's pride, she paused, one hand pressed to her lower back as she straightened up from setting seedlings. "Are you all right?" Kieran asked, immediately concerned. A small, secretive smile curved her lips. "I'm fine, just a bit tired lately." She hesitated, then added softly, "And I suspect I'll be more tired in the months to come." It took a moment for her meaning to register, but when it did, Kieran dropped his gardening trowel in shock. "Are you saying?" Bethany nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "Dr. Mercer confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Kieran." Joy unlike anything he had felt in years surged through him, tempered almost immediately by a flash of fear so intense it nearly took his breath away. The thought of loving another child, of risking that kind of loss again, was momentarily terrifying. Bethany saw the conflict in his expression and stepped closer, taking his dirt-stained hands in hers. "I'm scared too," she admitted quietly. "So scared, but also so very happy." Her honesty, as always, steadied him. "I am too," he said, squeezing her hands, "both scared and happy." He pulled her gently into his arms, careful not to hold her too tightly. "We'll face it together, whatever comes." "Together," she agreed, resting her head against his chest. As Bethany's pregnancy progressed, Kieran found himself oscillating between excitement and anxiety. He threw himself into preparations, expanding their house to add another bedroom, crafting a cradle from the finest wood he could find, building a rocking chair for Bethany that she declared the most comfortable seat in Montana. But in quiet moments, doubts crept in. Could he be the father this child needed? Had he learned enough from his mistakes with Thomas to do better this time? And always, lurking beneath these concerns, was the fear of loss, the knowledge that loving made one vulnerable in the most profound way possible. Bethany, with her usual insight, recognized his struggles. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, she took his hand and placed it on her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously. "Feel that?" she asked softly. "That's life, Kieran. That's hope. And yes, it's terrifying, but it's also the most wonderful gift we could be given." He nodded, throat too tight for words as he felt the strong movements of their unborn child. "Thomas would be so excited to be a big brother," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "He wouldn't want his memory to make you afraid to love this baby." Tears pricked Kieran's eyes at her words. "How do you always know exactly what I need to hear?" she smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Because I know you, Kieran Ellis. I know your heart." The baby arrived on a crisp October morning after a long, difficult labor that left Kieran pacing the porch, while Mrs. Patterson and the town's midwife attended Bethany inside. When at last he was called in, he found his wife exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your son," she said softly as he approached the bed with cautious steps. Kieran sat carefully beside her, heart pounding as she tilted the bundle toward him. A tiny face, red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair plastered to a perfectly shaped head. As he watched, the baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep blue depths that seemed to look straight into Kieran's soul. "He's perfect," Kieran whispered, reaching out to touch one miniature hand. The baby's fingers immediately curled around his, a grip surprisingly strong for one so tiny. "What shall we call him?" Bethany asked, her voice tired but happy. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one, both feeling it was something they would know when the moment arrived. Kieran looked at his new son, feeling a surge of love that was both familiar and entirely new. "James," he said after a moment. "James Thomas Ellis." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes as she nodded. "It's perfect," she agreed. "A name to honor both our pasts while we build our future." Little Jamie, as they came to call him, thrived under their care. He had Bethany's dark hair and serious expression, but Kieran's green eyes and dimpled smile when he was pleased. As he grew from infant to toddler, his personality emerged curious, determined, and affectionate. Kieran found that his fears, while not entirely banished, had receded in the face of daily joy. He was a more patient father than he had been with Thomas, more present, more appreciative of each small milestone. The grief for his firstborn remained, a room in his heart that would always be there, but it now existed alongside rooms filled with new love and laughter. When Jamie was 2, Bethany gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, a fair-haired, strong-willed child who had Kieran wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she first gazed up at him with James Norwood's deep brown eyes. Life was not without its challenges. The ranch suffered through 2 years of drought that strained their resources and tested their resilience. Whooping cough swept through the county when Jamie was 4, and though their children recovered, 2 others in town were not so fortunate. Bethany miscarried between Jamie and Sarah, a loss that reopened old wounds for both of them. Yet through it all, they clung to each other and to the life they had built. Their ranch prospered, expanding as they were able to purchase neighboring land. Their children grew healthy and strong, knowing they were deeply loved. And their marriage deepened, the passion of their early years maturing into an abiding partnership that sustained them through good times and bad. On the 10th anniversary of Thomas's death, Kieran rode alone to the small family cemetery on a hill overlooking their ranch. He had established the plot after his son's death, laying Sarah to rest there as well. Now it was a peaceful place, well tended, with wildflowers growing between the markers. He knelt by Thomas's grave, placing a hand on the weathered stone. "Hello, son," he said softly, feeling only a gentle sadness rather than the crushing grief of years past. "I've come to talk to you." For the next hour, Kieran spoke aloud, telling his firstborn about Jamie's latest adventures, Sarah's stubborn determination to ride the new colt before she was ready, Bethany's successful experiments with fruit preserves that had won prizes at the county fair. He spoke of the ranch, the changes to the town, the passing of old friends and the arrival of new neighbors. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hillside, he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Turning, he saw Bethany riding toward him, alone, having left the children with Mrs. Patterson for the evening. She dismounted and walked to stand beside him, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder. "I thought you might want company," she said simply. Kieran covered her hand with his own. "I'm glad you came." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the breeze rustling through the tall grass around them. "I was just telling Thomas about all he's missed," Kieran said finally. "About the life we've built." Bethany nodded, her expression soft with understanding. "I do the same with James sometimes. Tell him about the children, about you." "Does it help?" Kieran asked, though he already knew the answer. "It does," she replied. "It keeps him part of our story." Kieran rose to his feet, drawing her into a gentle embrace. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For what?" she asked, looking up at him. "For finding me when I was lost. For showing me how to live with grief instead of being consumed by it." He touched her cheek tenderly. "For giving me a second chance at happiness." Bethany's eyes shone with emotion in the fading light. "You did the same for me, you know. We found each other when we both needed it most." As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Kieran took his wife's hand and turned toward home. Behind them, the small cemetery stood peaceful on the hillside, a testament to loves lost but never forgotten. Before them lay the ranch house, windows glowing with welcoming light, where their children waited. It was not the life Kieran had once imagined for himself, not the path he would have chosen. Grief had rewritten his story as it had Bethany's, forcing them both down unexpected roads. But in finding each other, in choosing to risk love again despite knowing its cost, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. As they rode home together through the gathering dusk, Kieran felt a profound sense of gratitude. For Thomas and Sarah, whose love had shaped him. For James Norwood, whose widow had saved him. For Bethany, whose courage and compassion had shown him how to keep living when he thought it impossible. For their children, who brought new joy to each day. And for the mysterious workings of fate or providence that had brought him to this moment riding beside the woman he loved, toward the home they had built together, under a vast Montana sky filled with stars just beginning to shine. It was, Kieran realized, exactly where he was meant to be.